Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the fourth season of the LCLC podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Biberman. This fourth season is devoted to further examination of how thought, particularly humanistic thought, is now fleeing from the shelter of the American Academy into alternative spaces. I do so to further my work as LCLC director. I want to shape the conference to help it remain a premier event for poets, writers, critics, scholars, academics, and intellectuals interested in making sense of art, literature, and culture today. In this episode, I speak about the situation of Palestine and Israel with Tom Sleigh. Tom's many books include the 2023 Patterson Poetry Prize winner, The King's Touch, House of Fact, House of Ruin, Station Z, and Army Cats, all from Grey Wolf Press. His most recent book of essays is The Land Between Two Rivers, Writing in an Age of Refugees. Phil Clay calls Tom Sleigh our best essayist on political violence. I would add that in addition, he's among the very best American poets writing today, and perhaps without equal when it comes to writing poems about war and its consequences. I'm also happy to call him an old teacher and a good friend, so for all those reasons, I wanted to talk to him about what I had learned during my recent trip to Israel, a country he has yet to visit.
Good.
So I wanted to start with a thread I begun in our email. I told you that I had just returned from a trip to Israel, and you responded that you'd never been to Israel and talked or wrote a little bit about where you were in your decision-making process about making such a trip. I'd like to start by asking you to explain where you are in deciding whether or not to go to Israel.
Well, I would love to go to Israel. The problem is, and maybe this has changed, I don't know, but the person who I've traveled with on some of these jaunts to other countries, mainly about refugee issues, anyway. The guy who taught me everything I know is Chris Merrill, and Chris Merrill was an old school journalist and covered the Bosnian War, and now he runs the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa, and it's an amazing program because they bring about 30 writers from all over the world for a semester there, and Chris has been doing this for many, many years, and he takes American writers abroad, and whenever there's some particularly dicey place that he knows nobody else is stupid enough to go to, he calls me because he knows I will accept. So I've been to a lot of strange places with Chris in strange circumstances. I talked about going to Israel with Chris once, and he said to me, you'd have to get another passport. So I would have to get a new passport for the simple reason that he thinks that they would turn me back at the border when they saw my passport stamped with Lebanon, Libya, Syria, it's Jordan, etc. And so, well, I'd love to go. I would have to, go through the problem of getting another passport, which I'd be happy to do, and I'd be happy to do it right away. I don't have any, I'm not ideological in that way. I don't have views on the matter. Matter of fact, I'd love to see what's going on in Israel right now. Israel, I'd love to go. I'd love to see what's going on in Gaza right now. I don't think I probably will, because it would probably be quasi-suicidal to do such a thing. But if I've never willingly put myself in a war zone, although I've been in them because of the work you do with refugees, and you're almost inevitably in a war zone, a place that will be a war zone, et cetera, because of the situation that always surrounds refugee problems.
Right. Well, it's sort of a setup question so that I can tell you a little bit and begin at the beginning of getting on the LL flight. and give you a sense of whether or not I think Chris's advice still stands today in
That's great to know. Yeah.
2024. And so I decided, first of all, I I was debating whether or not to fly El Al or save some money and fly, a cut rate like Ryanair or Wizz Airlines. And a
Wait,
friend of mine,
just a Wizz Airlines?
there's an airline called Wizz Airlines. It's like one of these cut rate airlines out there, and they do operate. And a friend of mine, a former student who works now for the ADL,
Uh-huh.
who was advising me on this, said to me, "What are you, an idiot? You're flying El Al. There's no, not in these circumstances." No, because it's El Al, it's the Israeli government. And one thing's for sure, if commercial flight is allowed in and out of Ben Gurion Airport, El Al is flying. They may be flying with military assistance around it, but you're getting in and out of the country. Next question, like I'm surprised, and that proved to be a lifesaver, really, is that I booked in on El Al. And I booked out a Luton to save a little bit of money rather than flying out of Heathrow, although I was in London for a conference and I was tagging, I had extended my trip to include a week in Israel because, like you, I wanted to go.
Sure.
With much the same attitude that you just sketched as a writer and observer. So I'm flying out on the 31st and the 31st of July.
Right.
And that's the day that presumably Israel, I believe they took credit for one and remained silent for the other. There was the assassination in Tehran
Mm-hmm.
of the Hamas leader. And then there was also on the same day the assassination of a Hezbollah leader, where they did take credit for that, and they did link it as payback for the rocket attack on the Druze village of Majdal Shams. And I will end up going to Sfat, which, as you can see here, the children were transported to the medical center in Sfat.
Right.
So when I was visiting Sfat and walking around, I would imagine that some of those children were still in the medical center. And I was there for, believe it or not, there's an International Journal of Motorcycle Studies, such a thing exists. And I said to myself, I'm going to get halfway and go to this conference, and then I'm going to go to Israel because I just feel that I got to.
Yeah.
And the Sunday we went to Birmingham and to see the National Motorcycle Museum as a way to wrap up the conference. And I sat around at the table at the end of our tour with a bunch of motorcyclists, some of whom had ridden. I was in a car. And explain that I'm flying and that I'm going back to London and then flying to Israel. And people who had just been discussing quite rationally the fact that 1% of Britain's traffic is on two wheels, but it accounts for 25% of the vehicular deaths, were like, "Are you crazy? You're going to Israel now? Cancel the flight." And I said to them, "Look, as long as El Al lets me on their plane," and that comes back to your predicament, and as long as they're flying, I'm getting on the plane. I'll let you guys know when I come back that everything is safe and sound. And so I arrived, but I said to myself, "Geez, like, I better get there early because something tells me this may take some time for them to load this plane."
Yeah.
So I'm flying out at 8 and I get there at around 3. I took a bus.
That's early.
Yeah, that's early. And so I walk up and down and I can't find an El Al desk. Like there is no El Al desk until I spy, like tucked away, kind of hidden, rolled all the way into a corner, like it's a spy operation. Like the El Al stuff is over there, but they're not set up. And
Right.
so I get on the phone and they say, yeah, El Al, just keep an eye out and around 5:36 you'll see them. And I was like, okay, all right. So yeah, around 5:36 they come over and they set up in an empty space along the rows with Wiz, which had the majority of the space. And I thought to myself, this is going to take a long time. But of course, I was wrong in that this huge crowd, right? They processed the huge crowd in, no time flat, because every person getting on this plane on that day, flying back to Israel, the majority of them are Israeli citizens. The majority of them have clear reasons why they're getting on this plane.
Right.
And if this is how it ends for them, they're going back to be with Booby or whatever. This is their life. They're getting on the plane. We're done with you.
Right.
But when I get to the front of the line, the first question is, why are you going to Israel? And my answer is, I just want to check it out. And they're like, are you flying with anyone? And I said, no, I'm alone. And they said, are you meeting anyone there? And I said, no, not really. No. You have any family there? None that I know of. Okay, you stand over there.
You answered all those questions wrong, man.
You stand over there. And she was a nice, affable young woman. But I saw that there was this, linebacker, probably ex-Mossad or IDF or still Mossad, who's like, eyeing everything and like, you don't get on the plane till I tell you to get on the plane.
Right.
And he came over to me and he was like, so what's the story with you? And I said, I'm an English professor at the University of Louisville.
And the English professor. That was.
And I just want to see for myself what's going on over there. And then he asked me, you got any friends in Morocco? Any friends in Lebanon? Any friends in Syria? Have you traveled to any of these countries? And I said, my wife's Slovak, so I've been to Slovakia and I've been to a lot of Europe, but no, I haven't been to any of those countries. And then he asked me a couple other questions along the same line. You got any bombs in your luggage? Have you maybe taken packages from potential bombers? And then he said,
hey, not me, boss.
and he said, have a nice flight, have a nice trip.
Right.
And so I got on, but the thing is that my feeling is that if your previous trips occurred before you have a camera-ready passport, then yeah, I would say Chris is probably still correct, and that you should probably get a new passport, so that it doesn't show that paper trail.
Yeah, well, and there would be Syria, there would be Lebanon, there would be, Libya, all these countries which have, basically are clearly anti-Israel. So,
right.
Anyway, that's the official position. I don't know.
Right.
They're so fragmented. It's very difficult to even begin to make a generalization like that. But the official policy, I'm sure, is that. Yeah.
Right.
Look, the thing is, I'm glad that you decided to persist and that you weren't deterred by what people were saying.
Yeah. No, it's weird to describe that feeling. You are a master at it at this point. You've tried it.
Yeah.
Obviously not to your satisfaction, because you've gone back and tried it again and again to get that feeling of, and we've already started to talk about it,
Right.
that sense of heightened
Yeah.
existence that comes with
Yeah.
taking a roll of the dice like that,
Yeah.
whatever the odds may be, and that very often that feels like a preferable way to live than not to roll the dice and see what happens. So when I went, one of the other things that I did is that I thought about the number of different times I was going to be walking around, and I said to myself, break out the backpack. I mean, and you, my friend, with your back issues, I was like, that was the best decision I made, was to make sure that I could stuff. Here's my bags here. Make sure that I could stuff everything into
Oh my
a
goodness.
backpack.
Good.
All of this
Yeah.
stuff can go into that backpack,
Yeah.
and that's 3 days of 3 weeks of of plans there.
Sure.
And your book, this one, The Land Between Two Rivers, did not make the cut. I said to myself, I've read this enough that I'm not going to take it with me, and that may be one reason why it really stayed on my mind while I was over there, and particularly the first essay,
Yeah.
the deeds, and particularly when, after spending a little bit of time in Tel Aviv and then a little bit of time in uh, Jerusalem, and then a little bit of time via bus up to Tiberias, which is already going up north to the Sea of Galilee. I went down to the bus station and took a bus to Sfat, which is apparently about 10 miles or so from. Of course, we know it's not a real border; it's a state of war. So that fluid zone between Hezbollah and the IDF at this point. And while walking around Sfat, I really thought about the fact that the deeds is all about you going to a Palestinian refugee camp, they still call them, but they're more established than that. I wanted to ask you, from your perspective now, looking back on having written the deeds as well as the other essays that make up the
Sure.
bulk of The Land Between Two Rivers, why you wanted to write those pieces, and whether your take on things would change if you revisited them now.
The the reason I wanted to write them before was because it's kind of like what you said. You're suddenly in a place where, if you've never experienced the kinds of things you were just talking about earlier, that is that kind of sense of heightened intensity. Am I being an idiot? Am I taking unnecessary risks? Why would I choose to do this? Why wouldn't I, follow the advice of my motorcycle pals, even though getting on a motorcycle is probably equally as dangerous? You know, Part of the reason why I wrote those essays was simply to register the strangeness of being in a place in which the sense of your life potentially being in danger was something that you had to think about on a daily basis in a very concrete way, as opposed to the kind of automatic way that, I generally go through my daily life in the streets of New York. And, way beyond what anything that it had to do with my own individual small life was the kind of terrible sadness that you experience when you see so much violence so close at hand. And then, if you're a person like you are, who's deeply interested in not simply just, quote unquote, having feelings, but, understanding what the daily reality is like, what the scientific um, understanding of how a blast wave works, or all of those kind of small, minute details. I found completely fascinating and compelling to write about. What was not fascinating or compelling to write about was, you know, what do I think of the situation? I don't know. I wasn't born in that situation. I'm not an instant, pundit. I don't have prescriptions for how people are supposed to solve these problems. I express the kinds of contradictions that I see, but I'm mainly interested in talking about the contradictory states of mind that one is into, and without proposing any kind of banal or brilliant solutions at all. I don't really, there's a certain, in my mind, an outsider coming in, telling people what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to feel. That just feels repellent to me, and I really have no interest in doing that, and I've never wanted to do that. If I were to go back and do it again, I don't think my attitude would change. I would probably be more pessimistic than ever about the actual um, possibility of, real substantive change. And I think that there's just so many ways that people just pull um, people people kid themselves, I think, because often it just depends on what their role is in say a government. So your role is, I'm getting paid to solve problems. So you come up with solutions, which as soon as you walk around for 3 days, can't possibly work. So, when I got to Lebanon, this is a long time ago. This is when the neocons had come to power, Wolfowitz and so on. I mean, their idea was that they were going to abandon, the idea of land, for peace. Instead, it was going to be the old Cold War policy of peace through strength. And what peace through strength meant was arming Israel to the teeth, and then letting Israel be the adjudicator of all the different conflicting, wars going on in the Middle East, such that they would be the conduit for arms to all the countries around them.
I understand and share really your principles as an artist and a writer and an intellectual who's traveling and trying to work and get a sense of what they're witnessing. And in that spirit, I wanted to share with you my own sense of
Sure.
how I would update the deeds, given the fact that it was much on my mind and I was walking around, as I said, Spot, which is not that far from where you were walking around in Kana, although on the other side and with the other aggrieved party, let's say, that um, again and again in the way that you write the deeds, you you want to come back, as you say, you may be pessimistic, but there's a glimmer of hope. There's something that you want to rest your hopes on, and you write, Joseph was careful to distinguish between the actions of the Israeli and U.S. governments and ordinary citizens.
Yeah.
And my feeling in spending the time that I did mostly with Jews and Israelis
Mm-hmm.
is that this hope has really eroded, if not broken down entirely, and that there is no trust.
Yeah.
There is no trust anymore between at the level of wanting to, as Forster says, wanting to connect human to human,
Mm-hmm.
and that from the Israelis, the sense is that if we go back to a detail that you used to open the deeds, which is Joseph's, your guide and informant, telling you that uh, when he got there after the missile strike, you could hear the cell phones going off of people getting calls wanting to know, the relatives wanting to know if they were okay. And of course, the presumption is that they're dead under the rubble,
Right.
and that the sort of greatest advance in terror tactics with October 7th was the active utilization of the cell phone to include as many people through the cell phone as victims of the terror attack while it was happening, so that
Right.
they would seize the cell phones and they would execute family members while allowing other family members to be part of the terror attack through the cell phone itself. And that this sort of new, perhaps new, twist, it was a detail that I could seize upon, doing the kind of work that I learned how to do by reading you very closely.
Uh-huh.
That that I came away concerned that I don't know how this foundation of a kind of humanist, strategically humanist uh, link of solidarity across a war zone could be rebuilt. And like you, as an outsider, although Jewish, I just got back on a plane, fortunately, and flew out of the zone with
Yeah.
that question.
Yeah, I think you're right, Matt. I mean, if I were to rewrite these things, I mean, I would still have the same skepticism about, any kind of large scale statement, but I'm as pessimistic as you are.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I wanted to ask about, and it may seem, at least initially, to be a break in the theme of our conversation, is that you have shared with me that you're assembling a new and selected collection
Yeah.
of poems. And I immediately said, wait, don't tell me what's in it. I want to try to guess a little bit. But I certainly hope that the poem Widows is in it. Is Widows making the cut or not?
Well, I don't know yet. I mean, I'm still in the throes of it. There would be some poems. Um, I've just looked over the old work. I haven't come up. I know vaguely what the new work will be, and the I'd very much like to include a couple of sections in Widows, but I can't include the whole thing because basically, I don't know, when a book gets to be over 250 pages, particularly a book of poems, it's just too damn big, and then it sort of defeats the idea of a new and selected. So if I'm thinking around 60 pages, then I would definitely put some of it in.
Mhm.
It was such an interesting, poem to work on, just in terms of making a hinge between what we're talking about and the situation in between Israel and Lebanon and the rest of the Middle East. This poem seems utterly continuous with, my interest in, refugee situations. But, I was interested and also in the small scale ways in which people, maintain a sense of normalcy under these kinds of, attacks. and just the small things that they do to make themselves feel like they're human. And in the I was astonished when I began to write the poem that I discovered, that what I really decided I wanted to do was, rather than write, do a straight translation of the Iliad. Um, what I really wanted to do was just focus on two aspects of it, and that was really the private domestic aspect of it, and the private domestic aspect of it from the point of view of people who have lost people that they loved and their grief and how they dealt with it. And, there's Andromache on the one hand, and then there's Achilles on the other hand, and both of them felt like widows to me, because Achilles loses Patroclus and Andromache loses Hector. And I thought, well, what if you put those in the center of the poem? And what if you bring in other sources like some of the vase painting? And I was astonished at the vase painting, the kinds of things that happen in the vase painting, like this really shocking painting of Achilles lying on a couch, being served by a servant, and underneath the couch is the dead body of Hector, and all his wounds are still bleeding. Um, just
Right.
Yeah, I'm relaxing, having my wine and my this and my that, and meanwhile, the dead body of my
Right.
is underneath my couch as I eat. That kind
Right.
of brutality was astonishing, and then you put it in comparison with another vase painting, and that is, Patroclus is wounded, and his head is turned away because he doesn't want to look at the wound, and Achilles is binding up the wound, and he has this kind of deeply maternal look on his face, and it just gives you a much more sort of complete kind of broadly human picture of not necessarily how all of human beings act, but in particular, what this fictional character Achilles is like, what this other character of Patroclus is like, but completely taken out of the context of heroism.
Right. What I loved about it, and I'm happy to hear that in some form it's going to be included.
Yeah, well,
And I think that, I mean, to me, because of the context in which I've been mulling it over in my mind recently, Widows seems like the perfect title for a selected poems, because that's what you're doing. You are, offing some poems, and you are pulling some poems to safety and putting them back in. And in a weird way, the ones
that's a great
consigned.
suggestion, Matt. I mean, I love that suggestion because I don't have a title yet.
Well, I give it to you. I give it to you as a possibility, free of charge. Um,
Thank you.
it is that uh, the language that you've arrived at to tell that story, and you've tried and worked on Achilles and these story elements in earlier work. But to me, I want to say the purity of the the style that you've arrived at in Widows, it brings the material to life with a kind of spirit of today, and more specifically of that intensity that I feel, uh, and that you felt when on assignment in some place like Svot,
Mhm.
where the scene that you just described, namely, how can you sit there and enjoy wine and grapes and a meal with a
Yeah.
dead body under the table The answer is pull up a chair. The wine is good. The grapes are good. The dead body will be just fine. It's a dead body.
That's right.
And, and it's very hard to convey that. And I think you did an incredible job of doing it. And so I vote for its inclusion.
Well, it will be included in some form or another. I don't know if I can get the whole thing in there because I've just got the the space.
Right.
Yeah. But I'm glad you said that because, it's just such an odd vase painting because, all Hector's wounds are still bleeding, and then, and that of course goes against, basically, and this is the kind of nerd I am. So of course I looked it up and see how long do wounds bleed after they've been inflicted. And of course they say, well, they don't bleed for that long because their homeostasis is reached fairly quickly. And it's the same kind of mindset that wants to know, well, how do blast waves travel? It's the same kind of mindset, like in your case, you're interested in why the big bruiser of a guy is going to ask you these series of questions. And that's the thing that actually doesn't make it into people's thinking about, at least from the policy wonk standpoint, they don't really think about that kind of texture, And I think it's that kind of texture and fact that's the first thing that stood out in your mind is this guy's going to ask me all these questions and I'm going to answer no, 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 no. And of course, in the back of your mind is going on, well, what if I answered yes, 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 yes?
Right.
That puts you in this kind of state of inner division, creates anxiety. And that anxiety, when you multiply it over an entire population, that has profound effects, and nobody thinks about that.
Right. So another question I wanted to ask you had to do with my thoughts as a father, and I have two children. I have a 12-year-old son, and I have a 23-year-old daughter.
Yeah.
And your poems about and to Hannah, and I believe it's Dear Almost Dad, as you put it in one of the poems, but an apology to my daughter.
Yeah.
And that I very much went through the experience that is explored by you in that poem, in sharing with my daughter that I was going to go to Israel, and then the sort of communications that we sustained after I told her and while I was over there, that that she was the first one who said, "Dad, you're flying into a war zone," and the first one to really express wanting to grab me and say, "Look, you may die, and if you die, that's really going to impact me." And I'm not sure that you've factored that into your calculations, and also the fact that as a progressive young feminist who wishes to describe herself as an anti-Zionist and as somebody who desperately wants America to figure out how to reverse some of the policies that you're talking about and put the brakes on the Israeli Netanyahu war machine, knowing that her dad might end up, as my Israeli informant said, hustled into the back of some trunk of some car and taken hostage or killed, or both, is a real possibility. And the fact that she is making me confront the reality of what I'm doing, and I'm making her confront it as well, is allowed me anyway to really come to appreciate how good that poem is that you wrote as an apology to your daughter, and I hope it makes it good.
Oh, I think it will. Yeah, that poem will.
So
Matt, I'd be curious to know what your what was your answer to her?
As to why I was going
Mm-hmm.
and to why I was willing to take the risk that I was, and to potentially allow her to go through life with a dad who may not be with her anymore because of this silly need to go over and see for myself. I don't think I was able to give her a good answer, to be honest with you. I'm not sure.
Hmm.
I'm not sure what the answer would be, except that in some weird way, one is caught up in that arithmetic that is hidden in your poem about the fact that being a father means sacrificing yourself for a certain amount of years. And at the age of 23, I felt like I could give myself a hall pass and
Interesting.
go on and do this because I felt the need to do it.
That's interesting.
You
That's a
know,
really interesting answer. Very different, than my answer would be, and I bet it's really different for everybody who puts himself, potentially at risk, where everything's okay until it's not okay, and then it's too late.
right. And that gets me to another poem uh, that I wanted to ask about, which was Last Cigarette.
Oh yeah.
Because Last Cigarette is that kind of gimmick poem that I like Ambrose Bierce's Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge,
Right, right.
where you take us right through the moment when the guy does that last stupid thing that ends up leading to the Darwin Award, where you find yourself dead because you needed to smoke a cigarette and the sniper gets you.
Right.
So what about poems like that? Do they stand up in hindsight for you, or is that a widow that gets cast to the underworld?
For me in that particular poem, um, I like that poem. Well, I like that poem. I hate it when authors say I like that poem. It's just like it's so fucking self-regarding and it's stupid. You know, who knows? I mean, it's a poem. I wrote it. Whether or not it's any good, it's not for me to say.
Mhm.
Whether or not I like it, it's not for me to say. It just
But
seems.
will you include it?
Well, I think I would, and for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is because is that anybody in that circumstance, and I spent a lot of time around soldiers, is you find a way to smuggle in your pleasures, no matter how stressful a situation is. And so, if you can have a cigarette in the middle of, you know, a patrol or an orange field before you step on a landmine and blow yourself to kingdom come. Um, that poem came out of the specifically of that visit to Kana, and it was because you know everybody's orange fields were seeded with cluster bombs from the IDF had used, and many countries use them even though they're outlawed. And so the guy couldn't harvest his oranges. So the idea that there would be these big bangs and these little bangs, and that those big bangs and those little bangs were, coincident with each other, and you could be a kid blowing off firecrackers, or you could be, the big bang of the universe coming into being, or you could be this soldier, walking around and then deciding he was going to have a smoke before, he stepped on something or was shot by a sniper. uh, I just felt like that the moment of pleasure, the timelessness of the cigarette, that seemed to me to be a really interesting state to explore and enter into, even as a hypothetical. And so I think that poem will end up there because, like I say, I think there's never a situation that I've ever encountered no matter how grim it is, even if it's people starving to death, in which there is in some way, some moment, until it's the very end, or unless you're in just excruciating pain from your wounds, that doesn't have a moment of pleasure. And honestly, even when you're in an extremis and you're going to the very end of it, it's not like it's unrelieved. There, you can feel so miserable and then feel less miserable, and then the less miserable part is memorable simply because of the contrast. So, it's an interesting mental state. I'm always astonished by the way, the human brain can calibrate its way through awful physical pain and suffering.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, I think that that's a fascinating behind the scenes look at your affection for that poem and the way that it works. What is the story on this new memoir project?
Oh, well, that's a radically different enterprise. I may have mentioned to you at a certain point. In any case, I like to back into it when I talk about it. There's a very short book called The Sorrow Beyond Dreams by the Austrian writer Peter Hanke. And it's about his mother's suicide. And I read it must be 15 years ago when I was in Berlin for a semester, at the American Academy in Berlin. And I'd read Hanke before when I was in my 20s, and he published a book, called The Goalie's Anxiety at the Penalty Kick, which was basically 3 long prose pieces, and that was basically his introduction to an American audience. And then, he eventually won the Nobel Prize, and then he, wrote he made a bad bet, and and there's very complicated historical reasons why he made the bad bet, but nonetheless, he was just deeply wrong, uh, in terms of Slobodan Milosevic. But he won the Nobel Prize nonetheless, and he's a marvelous, marvelous writer. And so I read that book, and as soon as I finished reading it, it's very short, it's only about 80 pages. I knew I wanted to write a book like that about my mother. Because basically, it's the story of her life, but from the perspective of her death. And I knew I couldn't write the book until my mother died because I didn't know how the story ended. Well, 2 years ago, my mother also took her own life. And it was eerily similar to what, Hanke had been through. And so I kind of, my book, of course, is radically different. But I knew I wanted it to be extremely short. I knew I didn't want it to have the usual kinds of, elements of figure out of the past in a kind of, you know, therapeutic way, such that everything, one goes through becomes incorporated and, one comes out with a life affirming statement, all that kind of thing. I mean, I don't believe in any of that. So, I try to tell it as closely as possible as I can, from the point of view of, her, what she went through as a young woman, the kinds of terribly limited roles that were available to her as a farm girl in Western Kansas in the 30s during the Dust Bowl, being dirt. Mm-hmm. So that's what that book is, and it's kind of the strange circumstance of me helping her kill herself.
Right. Yeah, I listened to a podcast where you shared that. I don't know if you're the kind of writer who would want to go back and use that as notes, or whether you would want to stay away from it.
Well, basically, when I did that podcast, I hadn't yet written it, I think. And so, The experiences that I talk about in that podcast obviously come into play.
You're the doctor's going to off me. No, you're going to off yourself. I'm just here to help you.
Exactly. I mean, it really was like drawing room comedy, Matt, in a certain way during the last hour of it. It was just, it was kind of witty repartee. It was My Mother's Death is scripted by Oscar Wilde, and it was terrible in that sense. And it was, totally typical of my mother that, she would want to do that. I mean, and again, I think it was like mother, like son. So, she had a lifelong love of the classics, and she was a farm girl. She never heard of the classics. I mean, she was dirt poor. And she was the only person in her entire county to go to college, male or female. And when she went, she had, basically there are only two options. You could be a teacher or you could be a nurse. That's it. And so when she discovered that you could read classical literature, that became a lifelong obsession with her. And the fact is that during the last several years of her life, she had such bad macular degeneration she couldn't read, which is one of the great solaces of her life, that she said, I want people to read aloud to me. And of course, lots of friends volunteered to do that. But what she wanted to hear read aloud was The Story of Civilization by Will and Ariel Durant. And on the night before she offed herself, she had me read. We'd gotten to the Romans, and so I basically read to her the assassination of Julius Caesar and the fall of the Roman Republic, which I think the ironic juxtaposition of those two things, in which one of her favorite things to do was to call on my answering machine and say, "Beware the Ides of March, Tom," which is what the soothsayer says to Caesar before Caesar is assassinated. That's the strangeness of her mind, that was the strangeness of her mind. And it's why I deeply miss her. In certain ways, she was a terrible mother and a wonderful friend.
Right. Well, they say your mother's going to be the strangest woman you ever meet in your life. So
whoever said that's a wise person.
So as we wrap up our too brief conversation, hopefully we can have another one.
Sure.
I do see a thread, a Beckettian thread, I think, that runs through the stops of our conversational train today. The sense that as we approach the anniversary of October 7th, that it is hard to find optimism except in the way in which we can look at the attitude that we're holding on to in your hard-earned celebration of your mother, and the way in which her gift to you is manifest to a certain degree in poems like Widows, and in that ability to recognize that though we say again and again we can't go on, like Beckett, we go on.
Right. Yeah. I have to say the short prose, God, like Stirring Still, those things I've read over and over again. I absolutely love them,
Yeah. 70?
But
Good God.
I know.
70? Yes, Tom, you've arrived at 70.
71, pal.
Yeah.
But one of the things I just want to observe about this quote unquote interview is that it's been fascinating to me to listen to you talk about a lot of the issues which I don't really get to speak with people about unless they've been in the military or they've done, some kind of NGO work, but refracted through a skeptical consciousness like yours. Right. So it's been great to be able to talk to you on, but also just to have, I love the moment where you said, well, that moment of, common assertion of humanity, you just said that has been so eroded, I just don't have any hope that that's going to be repaired. And I certainly understand that. And I think that's if we're going to be downers, that's a good place to stop.
Right. At that point, I had many more notes, but I knew there was no point in. I had overwritten quite a bit there, but
But see, our reaction is to think that's funny as opposed to think that's depressing.
right. Yeah, that's the Beckettian clowns.
Exactly. Totally.
Yeah.
Exactly.
My thanks to Tom Sleigh. Widows, his remarkable revisioning of the Iliad, appears on Consequence Forum. His memoir, Rosie, will be published in April 2026 by Unbound Edition. If you've enjoyed this episode or any of the others, please consider liking, subscribing, leaving a review, and even perhaps telling a friend or two. Most especially, we'd love for you to join us at an upcoming LCLC conference. To learn more, reach out to me directly, Matthew Biberman, or you can find details at thelouisvilleconference.com. Thanks again for listening.